It was the kind of quiet suburb where every window held a story and every neighbor seemed trustworthy. But for the Henderson family, that trust was about to become their worst nightmare. On a chilly October evening, the moon hung low, painting shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns of the cul-de-sac in Whispering Pines, Ohio. The Hendersons' home, with its blue shutters and white picket fence, was usually filled with warmth and laughter. The bedroom of Emma and Jake on the second floor was adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars, giving the siblings a view of the constellations they loved so dearly. But on this particular night, as twilight surrendered to darkness, something sinister crept into the warmth of their home. Little Emma and Jake had been whispering to each other, their small voices muffled by the thick comforter as they played their favorite game, Nighttime Spies. They loved peeking through the curtains, imagining scenarios about the neighbors, and creating stories about what they might be up to. But that night, their excitement was tinged with something different, a chill that came not from the cold October wind, but from a presence they couldn't see. The following morning, the chill remained, but now it had taken something with it. Laura Henderson woke up to the cold sunlight streaming through her kitchen window. The coffee brewed in its usual rhythm, and Mark was getting ready for work. But the laughter of her children was missing. There was no thundering of tiny feet racing down the hallway, no excited chatter over breakfast. When she walked upstairs to wake them, the silence in their room screamed back at her. Emma and Jake had vanished. The window was slightly ajar, a soft breeze swaying the curtains. Their beds were untouched, the stuffed animals arranged just as they had left them the night before. The glow-in-the-dark stars overhead blinked down, indifferent to the nightmare that was about to unfold. The Henderson family had always been the embodiment of suburban normalcy. Mark Henderson, a dedicated father, often found himself working long hours as an engineer, his focus unwavering as he tried to provide a comfortable life for his family. Despite his late hours, he cherished every moment with his children, Emma and Jake, especially their bedtime rituals. Mark would tell stories of astronauts and explorers, inspiring his children's love for stargazing and adventure. Laura Henderson was the heart of the family. A loving mother and elementary school teacher, she balanced her time between her work and caring for her children. Laura was naturally empathetic, the type of person that neighbors would confide in when things got rough. She loved her quiet life in Whispering Pines, a suburban neighborhood that seemed to exist in its own little bubble of predictability. She never thought anything truly bad could happen there until now. Emma, at 8, was full of curiosity, always asking questions about the stars and the world beyond. Her older brother Jake, at 10, was protective of his sister. He enjoyed teaching her about constellations while they sat by the bedroom window, pointing out Orion or the Big Dipper whenever the sky was clear. They were close, sharing secrets and giggling late into the night as they played their games. Their home, with its white picket fence and cozy rooms, was part of a neighborhood where everyone knew each other. The neighbors greeted one another over morning jogs and barbecues, keeping an unspoken promise to watch out for each other's children. It was a community that prided itself on safety, a place where doors were often left unlocked, and children played freely until dusk. Next door to the Hendersons lived Mr. Samuel Grayson, a reclusive widower. He had moved to the neighborhood a few years back after losing his wife in a tragic accident. Grayson kept mostly to himself, though Laura would sometimes see him outside late at night, sitting in his yard or walking the perimeter of his property. He had a peculiar air about him, with his sharp, calculating gaze and quiet demeanor. His house was always dark, with the curtains drawn, and he was known for his unusual habits, like the strange symbols he left etched in the dirt around his yard. The other neighbors whispered about him but rarely confronted his odd behavior, dismissing it as the eccentricity of an old man. The night Emma and Jake disappeared, the Hendersons' perfect world began to fracture. The sense of security that had enveloped them started unraveling as Mark and Laura found themselves in a nightmare they never imagined. Laura clung to the hope that there was an innocent explanation, that maybe the children were playing somewhere and had fallen asleep. But hours passed, and as dusk approached once again, their absence turned into a cold, hard fact. The whispers started, among the neighbors, among the police, and within Mark and Laura's own minds. People couldn't help but glance at Mr. Grayson's house, with its closed curtains and eerie quiet. The police spoke to him briefly, their questions met with his calm insistence that he knew nothing of the children's disappearance. But his solitude, his peculiar nighttime routines, and his air of secrecy painted him as different, and different was dangerous. The Hendersons' once secure, familiar world was now tainted by fear, suspicion, and the looming presence of the unknown. Every house, every face that had once seemed trustworthy was now cast in shadow, and Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they had all missed something, that someone had been watching them all along. The disappearance of Emma and Jake cast a dark cloud over the Hendersons' neighborhood. In the days that followed, every corner of Whispering Pines was searched. Parks, playgrounds, even the quiet woods beyond the cul-de-sac. Mark and Laura spent sleepless nights combing through the streets, their calls for their children echoing unanswered. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers joined the search, but as each hour passed, hope began to dwindle, giving way to desperation and fear. Mark, once a man of reason and logic, started to notice things that hadn't caught his attention before. He observed Mr. Grayson from his own darkened window. Grayson, who seemed to be awake at all hours, moving silently in his yard, even in the dead of night. Mark noticed the strange symbols, intertwining spirals and angular shapes, that Grayson etched into the dirt along the property line. At first, Mark dismissed them as idle habits of a lonely old man, but now they seemed to carry a more sinister purpose. Laura, too, began to experience strange things. She'd hear whispers in the middle of the night, soft, distant murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere, yet felt achingly familiar. She told herself it was just her imagination, a product of exhaustion and anxiety. But the whispers became louder, almost recognizable, like the faint echoes of Emma and Jake's voices calling out to her. Laura would find herself jolted awake, heart pounding, straining her ears to catch any sound that might lead her to her children. The children's room remained untouched, the window still slightly ajar. Laura couldn't bring herself to close it, afraid that she might shut out any chance of them finding their way home. Mark, on the other hand, became obsessed with trying to make sense of what was happening. He spent hours staring at the symbols Grayson left, convinced they held some sort of meaning. His rational mind struggled against the creeping notion that there was something supernatural at play, something beyond his understanding. The neighborhood had never felt so cold, so foreign. People who had once exchanged warm greetings now locked their doors early, their eyes filled with suspicion. Mr. Grayson was at the center of their unease. His reclusive nature, his odd habits, and his unnerving calmness under scrutiny made him the prime suspect in the disappearance of Emma and Jake. Grayson insisted he knew nothing, that he was as distraught as anyone else, but his protests fell on deaf ears. The police questioned him multiple times, but there was no evidence to link him to the disappearance. He was strange, yes, but nothing concrete could be proven. Laura's distress turned inward, manifesting in vivid nightmares. She dreamt of Emma and Jake trapped in an endless maze, their frightened faces peeking out from around corners, their hands reaching for her, but always just out of reach. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, her heart aching with the helplessness that seemed to smother her each time she closed her eyes. Mark, too, was tormented, though in a different way. One day he received an anonymous message slipped under their front door. It was a single sentence. "They're not lost, just waiting to be found." The cryptic note made Mark's blood run cold. He kept it from Laura, afraid of deepening her despair. Instead, he delved into it himself, convinced it was a clue, a breadcrumb leading to his children. His obsession grew, fueled by the belief that someone, perhaps Grayson, was playing a twisted game with them. He began to follow Grayson's movements, sneaking out late at night to watch the old man. He saw Grayson pacing his yard, his lips moving as if in prayer or incantation, his hands forming shapes in the air. Mark was convinced that Grayson was connected to the disappearance, but how, he couldn't yet understand. The mounting tension began to erode the Hendersons' sanity. The world that had once seemed so familiar was now a web of unknowns and uncertainties. Laura and Mark's conversations turned into arguments. Mark's obsession with Grayson clashed with Laura's need for comfort and normalcy. They were both desperate, but in different ways. Mark sought answers, while Laura sought solace, and both found themselves slipping further away from each other as their children remained lost. The fear that had gripped their hearts spread throughout the community, and all eyes were on Mr. Grayson. But the whispers that Laura heard, the symbols Mark saw, none of it made sense. There was something more lurking beneath the surface, something dark that none of them could quite grasp, but it was there, waiting, inching closer to unravel them all. Mark's growing obsession with Mr. Grayson finally pushed him to the edge. He could no longer sit and watch as the days turned into weeks and his children remained missing. The anonymous note, Grayson's strange symbols, and his eerie nighttime rituals had created a storm in Mark's mind, a storm that he could no longer ignore. He had to confront Grayson, no matter the risk. One cold, moonless night, Mark made his move. He waited until Grayson was outside, pacing his yard as usual. Mark approached cautiously, his heart pounding as he crossed the property line. Grayson looked up, his eyes dark and tired, but not surprised. He seemed to have been expecting Mark. "Where are my children?" Mark demanded, his voice trembling with rage and desperation. Grayson didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a deep sigh, his expression softening with something that almost looked like pity. "You don't understand," Grayson said quietly, shaking his head. "I'm trying to help them. To help all of you." Mark lunged forward, grabbing Grayson by the collar, but the old man made no effort to resist. He simply looked at Mark, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to pierce through Mark's anger. "Come inside," Grayson said, "if you truly want to understand." Despite every instinct telling him to walk away, Mark followed Grayson into his house. The interior was dimly lit, the walls lined with books and strange hand-drawn diagrams. The air was heavy with the scent of herbs and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. Grayson led Mark to a small room at the back of the house. In the center of the room was a worn armchair, and next to it, a table covered in old photographs, candles, and a strange glass-like object that seemed to shimmer in the low light. Grayson gestured for Mark to sit. Hesitant but desperate, Mark obeyed. Grayson took a seat across from him and picked up the shimmering object, a small crystal shaped like a tear. He held it in his hands, his eyes closing as he took a deep breath. "What I'm about to show you, it isn't easy to understand," Grayson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it's the only way to find them." Suddenly, Mark felt a strange sensation, a pulling like the world around him was shifting, blurring at the edges. The room seemed to fade, replaced by darkness. And in that darkness, Mark saw them, Emma and Jake. They were standing in a vast, empty maze, their eyes wide with fear. He could hear them calling out to him, their voices echoing, overlapping with Grayson's words, distant yet clear. "They are trapped in their own fears," Weston Grayson said, his voice echoing in Mark's mind. "I can guide you to them, but you must face what lies within." Mark realized that he was no longer in Grayson's house. He was inside the maze, the same maze from Laura's nightmares. It was endless, with high, shadowed walls that twisted and turned, stretching out into infinity. He could feel the fear that gripped his children, the cold dread that seeped into his bones. He turned, and there was Grayson standing beside him, his expression weary. "This is a place of the mind," Grayson explained, "a shared space born from dreams and fears. I used to help people find peace here, but now it's different. Now it's chaos." Mark's heart raced as he moved forward, Grayson following close behind. He could hear Emma and Jake's voices, distant but growing louder with each step. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he rounded corner after corner, the maze shifting and changing before his eyes. It was disorienting, terrifying, but he refused to stop. Finally, he saw them, Emma and Jake huddled together at a dead end, their faces pale, their eyes wide with tears. Mark's heart clenched as he rushed to them, dropping to his knees as he pulled them into his arms. They felt real, solid, and the warmth of their small bodies filled him with hope. But the maze wasn't done with them. The walls began to close in, the shadows thickening, the air growing colder. Grayson stepped forward, his hands raised, his voice low as he murmured something Mark couldn't understand. The shadows seemed to recoil, the walls halting their advance. "You must take them back," Grayson said, his voice strained. "But you must understand, this is not just my doing. The darkness here, it's a part of you too." Mark didn't fully understand, but he nodded, holding his children close as Grayson continued to chant. Slowly, the maze began to fade, the shadows dissolving into nothingness. Mark felt a lurch, like he was being pulled upward, and suddenly he was back in the chair, his arms still wrapped around Emma and Jake. He blinked, disoriented, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of Grayson's room. Emma and Jake were there, real and alive, clinging to him, their eyes filled with tears. Grayson sat back, his face pale, his eyes closed in exhaustion. Mark's heart swelled with relief as he held his children close, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. He looked at Grayson, his mind reeling with questions, but the old man was too weak to answer. Mark had found his children, but the journey had revealed more than he had ever imagined. The maze, the darkness, Grayson's twisted methods had saved them, but at a cost. The old man had been trying to guide them, but the shadows he manipulated had taken on a life of their own, feeding off the fear and grief that lingered within them all. Mark held his children tightly, their small bodies trembling against him. Relief surged through him, but it was fleeting. As he glanced at Mr. Grayson, slumped in his chair, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. The children's disappearance, the maze, the darkness that lurked within their minds. Emma and Jake were safe, but the experience had left scars, not just on them, but on Mark as well. Emma looked up at her father, her eyes wide and still filled with fear. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We couldn't find the way out. There were voices, and we tried to follow them, but they kept getting farther away." Mark's heart sank. The maze, the voices, the endless pursuit, it was all too real, and he could see the confusion and terror still etched on his children's faces. He turned to Grayson, who was slowly regaining his strength, his breathing shallow but steady. "You have to explain this," Mark demanded, his voice low and hoarse. "What is that place? How could you pull us in like that?" Grayson opened his eyes, his gaze weary and filled with a sadness that seemed to go beyond the room they were in. "It's a construct," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A place between dreams and reality. When my wife died, I found a way to reach her. At least, I thought I did. It became my obsession, to guide others who were lost, to give them peace, but I was wrong. That place, it takes on a life of its own. It draws from the darkness we carry, and sometimes it becomes something we can't control." Mark's mind struggled to comprehend what Grayson was saying. The old man had tried to guide souls through their grief, through their fears, but in doing so, he had unleashed something far more dangerous, something that had almost consumed Emma and Jake. The maze had been a reflection of their fears, a manifestation of the grief that had gripped the Henderson family since the children disappeared. Mark looked at his children, Emma's tear-streaked face, Jake's haunted expression, and he knew that they had seen things no child should ever have to face. He hugged them tighter, his own heart aching with the realization that their journey through the maze was only part of what they would have to endure. Grayson's voice cut through the silence. "I never wanted this," he said, his eyes closing in exhaustion. "I wanted to help, but the shadows, they're not just mine. They belong to all of us. You brought your own darkness into that place, and it twisted everything." Mark wanted to scream, to rail against the old man's words, but deep down, he knew there was some truth in them. The maze hadn't just been a creation of Grayson's twisted mind. It had been shaped by his own fears, his own desperate longing to find his children. The whispers that Laura had heard, the symbols that Mark had seen, they were all connected, threads woven into a nightmare that had nearly destroyed them. But they were out, Emma and Jake were back, and for now, that was enough. Grayson slumped back in his chair, his eyes filled with exhaustion. He looked at Mark, his expression filled with something like regret. "Take them home," he whispered. "They need you now more than ever. And remember, the shadows are always there, but so is the light. You just have to choose which to follow." Mark stood, lifting Emma and Jake in his arms. He nodded once, his eyes meeting Grayson's for a moment before turning away. He carried his children out of the dim, cluttered house, the cool night air greeting them as they stepped onto the porch. He took a deep breath, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. Right now, all that mattered was getting Emma and Jake home. The walk back to their house was silent, the neighborhood dark and still. Mark felt the eyes of the other houses on him, the unspoken questions of neighbors who had once been friends. But he ignored them, focusing only on his children, who clung to him as if he were their lifeline. As they stepped into their home, Laura rushed forward, her eyes wide with disbelief and tears streaming down her face. She pulled them all into a tight embrace, her sobs breaking the silence that had settled over them. Mark held her, feeling the warmth of his family, the bond that had been tested but not broken. The nightmare was over, or so they hoped. But as Mark looked out the window toward Grayson's darkened house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness they had faced was not entirely gone. It lingered, a shadow just beyond the edges of his vision, a reminder of how fragile their reality truly was. The days that followed Emma and Jake's return were anything but ordinary. The Henderson home, once filled with laughter and warmth, now carried a heavy silence. Laura kept the children close, unwilling to let them out of her sight, as if any moment they might slip away again. The house felt like a fortress, every door double-locked, every window bolted shut, and even the smallest noise made them all jump. Emma and Jake were found, but the scars from their ordeal ran deep. They refused to speak about what had happened, their memories fragmented and hazy. At night, they would wake up screaming, their voices echoing through the dark halls, sending Laura rushing to their side. The children spoke of the maze, of the cold walls that seemed to stretch forever, and of the shadows that whispered to them, taunting them as they searched for a way out. Laura would hold them, whispering words of comfort, but she knew she couldn't truly banish the fears that haunted them. Mark, too, struggled with the aftermath. He kept replaying the events in his mind, wondering if he had done the right thing by trusting Grayson, by stepping into that nightmare. The image of the maze, of Emma and Jake's frightened faces, and of Grayson's weary eyes haunted his thoughts, invading his sleep, leaving him restless. He felt like a stranger in his own home, disconnected from the family he loved. The weight of what they had gone through bore down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from over. Grayson had been taken into custody after Mark called the police. He offered no resistance as they led him away, his expression vacant, his eyes hollow. The neighbors watched from their windows, whispering among themselves, their unease palpable. To the community, Grayson was a monster, a man who had preyed on innocence, who had taken Emma and Jake for reasons they couldn't fathom. But Mark knew the truth was far more complicated. Grayson's intentions, however misguided, had not been purely malicious. He had tried to help, but in doing so had unleashed something far more dangerous, a force that could not easily be contained or understood. The neighborhood changed in the wake of the children's disappearance. Whispering Pines, once a place of trust and camaraderie, became a shadow of its former self. People no longer left their doors unlocked, and the air was thick with suspicion and fear. The houses that once seemed warm and inviting now looked cold, their curtains drawn, their lights dimmed. Parents kept their children close, and the once lively streets grew quiet, devoid of the laughter and play that had once filled them. Mark and Laura did their best to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it was an uphill battle. Laura took a leave of absence from her job, dedicating her time to caring for Emma and Jake, trying to help them heal. She filled their days with comforting routines, reading stories, baking cookies, and taking short walks in the backyard. But every smile, every moment of normalcy was tinged with the unspoken fear that still gripped their hearts. Mark returned to work, though his mind was rarely on the task at hand. He found himself drawn to the window, staring out at the neighborhood, his thoughts drifting back to Grayson's words. The shadows are always there, but so is the light. You just have to choose which to follow. The darkness they had faced had come from within, fed by their fears, their grief, and their despair. It was a realization that haunted Mark, leaving him wondering if they would ever truly be free of it. The Hendersons did their best to move forward, but the shadows of that night lingered. Emma and Jake began to smile again, though their laughter was quieter, their joy more subdued. They were no longer the carefree children they once were, and that loss weighed heavily on Mark and Laura. They knew they had been changed, each of them touched by the darkness in their own way. The neighborhood too bore the scars of what had happened. People spoke less, kept to themselves, and there was a palpable tension that hung in the air. The story of Emma and Jake's disappearance and the strange old man who lived next door became the kind of whispered tale that parents told in hushed voices, a cautionary story meant to keep children safe. But no one truly understood what had happened, and that uncertainty bred fear. As the days turned into weeks, the Hendersons tried to find peace, though it felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. Laura clung to hope, focusing on the small victories, Emma sleeping through the night, Jake laughing at one of Mark's silly jokes. They were healing slowly, but the path was uncertain, and the shadows still lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Mark stood in the children's room one night, looking out the window at the stars above. The glow-in-the-dark stars that Emma and Jake had loved so much still adorned the ceiling, their soft light casting gentle patterns across the walls. He took a deep breath, trying to let go of the fear, trying to believe that they could move past it. But as he stood there, the wind outside began to pick up, the branches of the old oak tree scraping against the side of the house. For a brief moment, Mark thought he heard it again. The whisper. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkened room, his heart pounding. The whispering stopped, leaving only the rustling of the leaves outside, but the chill lingered. The darkness was still there, just beyond the window pane, and Mark knew it always would be. But he also knew that as long as he had his family, he would fight to keep the light alive, no matter how thin the veil between the two might be. The Hendersons tried their best to rebuild their lives. The days turned into months, and while the wounds began to heal, the scars remained, etched deep into their minds and hearts. The children slowly returned to school, their laughter cautious, their smiles hesitant. Laura went back to teaching, though her eyes were often distant, haunted by memories she couldn't quite shake. Mark, too, attempted to focus on work, burying himself in projects, though his thoughts often drifted back to the nightmare they had lived through. The neighborhood, once vibrant and filled with life, remained subdued. The residents of Whispering Pines moved forward with their lives, but there was a sense that something had irrevocably changed. Grayson's house stood empty, the windows dark. The once mysterious symbols in the yard now overgrown and fading into the earth. No one spoke of him, and the story of what had happened was buried under layers of rumors and half-truths. One night, as winter gave way to spring, Laura tucked Emma and Jake into bed, reading them a story that they had loved before the nightmare began. A story about explorers and their adventures under a sky filled with stars. The children listened quietly, their eyes heavy with sleep. Laura smiled softly as she watched them drift off, their breathing steady, their faces calm. She leaned over, kissing each of them on the forehead before quietly leaving the room. Mark was downstairs sitting in the living room, a cup of coffee growing cold on the table in front of him. He stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the dark silhouette of Grayson's old house. The curtains were drawn, the place looking like an empty shell, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered there. He turned his head as Laura entered the room, her face softening when she saw him. "They're asleep," she said quietly, coming to sit beside him. "They had a good day today. I think they're getting better." Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I hope so," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, taking Laura's hand in his, holding it tightly. For a moment, there was silence between them, a quiet comfort that they both needed. But then, just as the silence seemed to settle, Mark heard it, a whisper, soft and distant, barely audible, but unmistakable. His grip on Laura's hand tightened, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. Laura noticed his change in demeanor, her brow furrowing. "Mark?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He turned to her, his eyes wide, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Laura's eyes searched his, confusion and fear slowly spreading across her face. She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No. Mark, what is it?" He looked back toward the window, his breath caught in his throat. The whisper had faded, but the chill remained, creeping along his skin, settling deep in his bones. It was the same whisper he had heard that night, the night he had brought his children back. A reminder that the darkness was still there, just beyond the edges of their reality, waiting. Mark took a deep breath, forcing himself to smile at Laura, though the fear lingered in his eyes. "It's nothing," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. Just my imagination." Laura nodded, though the uncertainty remained in her eyes. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes as they sat together in the dimly lit room. Mark wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his gaze drifting back to the window, to the darkness beyond. And as the wind whispered through the trees outside, Mark knew that the shadows would always be there, lurking just beyond the window pane, waiting for a moment of weakness. But as long as he had his family, he would keep fighting, holding on to the light no matter how thin the line between nightmare and reality might be. In the stillness of night, The whispers never fully fade, reminding the Hendersons that some horrors dwell just beyond the window pane.